You are listening to HOA Neighbor Wars. I brought facts, not feelings. My name is not important, but what matters is I am standing in my own driveway in Burlington, Vermont, watching a tow truck back up to my car while Nancy Mitchell screams at me about a guest pass that somebody moved 2 inches to the left on my dashboard. I moved to Burlington 6 months ago because the rent was reasonable and I needed to be close to my daughter for our custody schedule. I work as a landscape irrigation tech, which means I am out in the field most days fixing sprinkler heads and dealing with broken valves, and I come home tired. The heights at Summit Ridge Design Review Association sounded fancy in the listing, but the reality is this place is run like a prison camp where the board calls everything a towable offense. Nancy is the landscaping committee lead, which apparently gives her authority over every blade of grass, every car, and every guest who dares to visit. She has been complaining daily since I moved in, always finding something wrong, always threatening fines, always holding her clipboard like a weapon. Today she is saying my guest pass was never displayed properly, even though I can see it right there on the dashboard. My friend came over last night, parked in the guest spot, and must have adjusted the pass when he got out. Nancy is claiming it does not count because it moved, and now she has called her favorite tow vendor to haul my car away while I am standing right here. I said, "Nancy, the pass is right there. You can see it." She said, "Keep talking. I love adding notes." She tapped her pen on her clipboard and smiled like she had already won. I said, "This is insane. You cannot tow my car because the pass shifted 2 inches. She said, "I can fine you daily until you give up and you cry," and she meant every word. The tow driver is a guy named Rick, who I have seen here 3 times in the last month. He does not look at me, just checks his phone and waits for Nancy to give the signal. I realize in that moment that this is not random. Nancy has a relationship with this tow company, and every time she calls them, she gets a cut. I do not have proof yet, but the way she smiles when Rick shows up tells me everything I need to know. I pull out my phone and start recording. Nancy immediately puts her hand up and says, "You cannot record me without permission." I said, "This is my driveway, and you are about to tow my car illegally. I am recording everything." She turned to Rick and said, "Go ahead, hook it up." Rick hesitated, looked at me, then looked at Nancy, and I could see him doing the math. I said, "Rick, if you touch my car, I am filing a police report and a complaint with the state towing board, and I will make sure your license is reviewed." He lowered the wheel lift arm but did not leave. Nancy said, "You think you are so smart. Let me tell you how this works." The HOA claims the fine schedule changes at the first of the month, and the deadline is tomorrow. So if you do not pay the existing fines and fix this violation by midnight tonight, the daily rate doubles, and you will never catch up. She tapped her clipboard again. I said, "What existing fines?" She said, "Check your mailbox. You have been in violation for weeks." I went inside and found a stack of violation notices that had been shoved under my doormat, not in the mailbox. Every single one was dated within the last 10 days, and every single one claimed I had failed to display my parking decal, failed to register my guests, failed to keep my car within the painted lines, failed to avoid the fire lane, and failed to update my emergency contact. The total was over $1,100. And the notices said if I did not pay immediately, they would place a lien on my unit and tow any vehicle on site. I walked back outside and said, "Nancy, these notices are fake. Half of these violations never happened." She said, "Prove it." I said, "I have photos of my car in the correct spot every single day." She said, "Photos can be edited." I said, "Are you serious right now?" She said, "The board reviews all appeals, and the next meeting is in 3 weeks. so you can wait until then, or you can pay now and avoid the lien. Either way, your car is getting towed today if you do not move it to the approved overflow lot by 5 p.m. I said, "There is no overflow lot." She said, "Yes, there is. It is behind the clubhouse, and there is a $50 daily fee to park there." I said, "You are making this up as you go." She said, "Keep talking. I love adding notes." And she wrote something on her clipboard with exaggerated strokes. Rick was still sitting in the tow truck, engine idling, watching us like this was a show. I realized I had about 4 hours before the arbitrary deadline, and I had to pick up my daughter from school at 3. If my car got towed, I would miss pickup, and my ex would use that against me in court. The custody schedule is the one thing I cannot afford to screw up, and Nancy knows it because I mentioned it once at a neighborhood meeting when I asked for a guest pass extension. She smiled when I said it, and now I understand why. I acted like I was backing down, because timing was the whole weapon. I said, "Fine, Nancy. I will move the car." She said, "Good, and make sure you register it in the overflow lot by 5 or Rick comes back." I said, "Understood," and I got in my car and drove away. She watched me go, arms crossed, looking pleased with herself. I did not go to the overflow lot. I went to my buddy Jason's house 3 blocks away and parked in his driveway. Then I called my attorney, a guy named Ben, who handled my custody case and said he could look at HOA disputes if needed. I explained the situation, and he said, "This sounds like selective enforcement and possible vendor kickbacks. You need records." I said, "How do I get those?" He said, "File a records request with the HOA management company. They have to provide meeting minutes, vendor contracts, and enforcement logs within 10 business days." I said, "I do not have 10 days. He said, "Then file it today, and also file a complaint with the state attorney general about the towing threats. That will get their attention faster." I hung up and immediately sent an email to the HOA management company requesting all records related to towing enforcement, vendor selection, guest parking policies, and fine schedules for the last 12 months. I CC'd Ben and also CC'd the state attorney general's office with a short complaint about threatening to fine or blacklist tow vendors who refuse to play along and using arbitrary deadlines to coerce payment. I hit send and felt a tiny bit of control return. Then my phone exploded. The neighborhood group chat, which I barely ever check, was blowing up with messages. Someone had posted a photo of me in my car with the caption, "This guy thinks the rules do not apply to him. Refuses to follow guest parking policy. HOA is trying to keep us safe, and he is making it harder for everyone." The photo was taken from across the street, zoomed in, and showed my car in the driveway with the guest pass visible on the dashboard. The comments were brutal. People I had never spoken to were calling me entitled, selfish, a hazard, and worse. One person said I should be fined daily until I move out. Another said they saw me park in the fire lane once, which was a complete lie. I realized Nancy had started this. The post had her fingerprints all over it, and within an hour, the narrative was set. I was the villain, and she was the hero protecting the neighborhood. I tried to post a reply explaining that the pass was displayed and that Nancy was lying, but the group admin, who I later found out was Nancy's friend, deleted my comment and said, "No personal attacks. Keep it civil." I was being attacked in every comment, but I was not allowed to defend myself. I picked up my daughter at 3 and took her to get ice cream. She asked why I looked upset, and I said, "Just some stuff with the neighborhood, nothing for you to worry about." She said, "Is it the mean lady who yells at you?" I said, "Yeah, the mean lady." She said, "You should tell her to stop." I said, "I am working on it, kiddo." We spent the rest of the afternoon at the park, and I tried not to think about the deadline or the group chat or Rick's tow truck. At 6 p.m., I got a text from an unknown number. It said, "Your car was not in the overflow lot by 5. Tow authorization has been issued. Your vehicle will be impounded within 24 hours unless you pay the fines and fees in full. Total due is now $1,400. I did not respond. I knew it was Nancy or someone working with her, and I was not going to engage. The next morning, I woke up to another violation notice taped to my front door. This one said I had damaged common property and must pay immediately or be charged daily. The alleged damage was a sprinkler head near my unit that had cracked, which was insane because I am a landscape irrigation tech and I would never damage a sprinkler head. I checked the head, and it was old, sun-damaged, and had clearly failed on its own. I took photos and video, then sent them to Ben with a note saying, "They are inventing violations now." Ben replied, "This is harassment. Document everything. I am drafting a cease and desist letter to the board and the management company. In the meantime, do not pay anything and do not sign anything." I said, "What if they actually tow my car?" He said, "If they tow your car from your assigned spot or your driveway without a legitimate violation, that is conversion, and you can sue. But try to avoid that. Park somewhere safe until we resolve this." I kept my car at Jason's house and started riding my bike to work. It was inconvenient, but it kept my car out of Nancy's reach. For 3 days, things were quiet. Then, I got a call from the HOA management company. The woman on the phone said, "We received your records request and your attorney's letter. We are reviewing the matter and will respond within the required time frame." I said, "What about the fines?" She said, "The board is handling enforcement, and we do not interfere with that process." I said, "Even if the fines are fake?" She said, "If you believe the fines are incorrect, you can appeal at the next board meeting." I said, "The next meeting is in 3 weeks, and they are threatening to tow my car today." She said, "I cannot help you with that," and she hung up. I realized the management company was useless. They were not going to do anything unless forced, and the board had free rein to do whatever they wanted. I needed leverage, and I needed it fast. That afternoon, I went to the county clerk's office and pulled the HOA's corporate filings, meeting minutes, and financial disclosures. It took 2 hours, but I found something interesting. The HOA had signed a contract with Rick's towing company, Summit Tow and Recovery, that gave them exclusive rights to all towing in the neighborhood. The contract included a clause that said the HOA would receive a percentage of all towing fees as a partnership revenue share. In other words, every time Rick towed a car, the HOA got paid. And guess who signed the contract on behalf of the HOA? Nancy Mitchell, landscaping committee lead, acting as interim board treasurer. I made copies of everything, sent them to Ben, and kept a set for myself. Ben called me within an hour and said, "This is exactly what we needed. The contract is a conflict of interest, and if Nancy is personally benefiting from towing enforcement, that is a breach of fiduciary duty. We can use this." I said, "How?" He said, "First, we send the evidence to the HOA's insurance carrier and the management company. If they know the board is operating outside the bylaws and creating liability, they will force a change. Second, we go to the next board meeting and present this publicly. Third, if they do not back down, we file a lawsuit for abuse of process and seek an injunction." I said, "What if they tow my car before the meeting?" He said, "Then we file for an emergency restraining order, but let's try to avoid that. Keep your car off the property for now." I agreed, but I was tired of hiding. I wanted to confront Nancy directly and make her explain herself. So I went to the clubhouse during her office hours. She was sitting at a folding table with her clipboard and a stack of violation notices, looking like she was running a small dictatorship. I walked in and said, "Nancy, we need to talk." She looked up and said, "Do you have an appointment?" I said, "No, but I have questions about the towing contract." Her face changed. The smugness disappeared, replaced by something colder. She said, "I do not know what you are talking about." I said, "Summit Tow and Recovery. Partnership revenue share. You signed it." She said, "That contract is confidential HOA business." I said, "It is public record, Nancy. I pulled it this morning." She stood up and said, "You have no right to harass me. I am calling security." I said, "There is no security, Nancy. It is just you and your clipboard." She said, "Get out or I will have you removed from the property." I said, "You cannot remove me from the property. I live here." She picked up her phone and dialed. I did not wait to see who she called. I walked out, got on my bike, and rode home. 10 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up to my unit. The officer knocked, and I opened the door. He said, "We got a call about a disturbance at the clubhouse." I said, "There was no disturbance." I asked the HOA representative about a contract, and she did not like the question. He said, "She said you were aggressive and threatening." I said, "I was not. I have a witness if needed, and I have my phone recording in my pocket if you want to check the timestamp." He looked at me, looked at his notes, and said, "Just stay away from her for now, okay?" I said, "She is the one threatening to tow my car and fine me thousands of dollars for made-up violations." He said, "That is a civil matter. I cannot help you with that." He left, and I felt the walls closing in. That night, I got another text from the unknown number. It said, "Final warning. Your car will be towed tomorrow at 9 a.m. if you do not pay in full and comply with all parking regulations." I screenshotted it and sent it to Ben. He said, "Do not respond. Let them make the next move. We are ready." The next morning, I moved my car back to my assigned spot. I put the guest pass on the dashboard exactly where it was supposed to be, and I parked perfectly within the lines. Then I set up my phone on a tripod inside my living room window, aimed at the driveway, and hit record. If Nancy or Rick showed up, I would have it on video. At 8:45 a.m., Rick's tow truck pulled into the neighborhood. I watched him drive slowly past my unit, then circle back and park across the street. Nancy appeared a few minutes later, walking fast with her clipboard and a handheld scanner. She scanned my license plate, looked at the screen, then looked at my windshield. I could see her squinting, trying to find something wrong. She walked around the car twice, took photos with her phone, then waved Rick over. I walked outside and said, "Nancy, what are you doing?" She said, "Your vehicle is in violation." I said, "Of what?" She pointed at the guest pass and said, "That pass is expired." I said, "It is not expired. It is valid through the end of the month." She said, "It was issued for a guest, and you are the resident, so it does not apply to your vehicle." I said, "That makes no sense. The pass is for this spot and I am parked in this spot." She said, "The rules are clear. Residents must display a resident decal, not a guest pass." I said, "I have a resident decal. It is on my bumper." She said, "It is not visible from this angle, so it does not count." Rick was standing behind her, looking uncomfortable. I said, "Rick, you know this is garbage. She is inventing rules to justify a tow." He shrugged and said, "I just do what the HOA tells me." I said, "The HOA does not have the authority to tow a car from a private assigned spot for a decal angle issue." She said, "Yes, we do, and if you do not move your car right now, it is getting hooked up." I pulled out my phone and said, "Nancy, I am recording this, and I am also recording your handheld scanner. If you tow my car based on a fake violation, I will file a police report, a complaint with the state, and a lawsuit." She said, "Go ahead. I have documentation." She held up her clipboard like it was a shield. I said, "I have documentation too, and mine includes your towing contract with Summit Tow and the revenue share clause." Her face went white. She said, "That contract is confidential." I said, "It is public record, and I already sent it to your insurance carrier and the state attorney general." She said, "You did what?" I said, "I forwarded the evidence to the HOA attorney and watched the tone change instantly. I am done playing games, Nancy. You have been running a scam, and it is over." Rick took a step back and said, "I am not towing this car." Nancy turned on him and said, "You have to. We have a contract." He said, "Not if it is illegal." "We don't." He got in his truck and drove away. Nancy stood there, shaking, holding her clipboard like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She said, "This is not over," and she walked away. I went back inside and called Ben. I said, "She just tried to tow my car again, and Rick refused." Ben said, "Good. That means the pressure is working." I got a call this morning from the HOA's attorney. They want to meet. I said, "What do they want?" He said, "They want to settle. They know the contract is a problem, and they do not want this going public." I said, "What kind of settlement?" He said, "They are offering to void all the fines, issue a written apology, and terminate the towing contract." I said, "What about Nancy?" He said, "They did not say, but I am guessing she is going to be removed from the board." I said, "I want more. I want a policy change that prevents this from happening to anyone else." Ben said, "I will ask. Let me handle the negotiation." 2 days later, Ben called me back and said, they agreed. The board is adopting a new policy that requires third-party review of all fines over $500, prohibits exclusive towing contracts, and mandates that all violation notices include photo evidence and an appeal process. They are also issuing a public statement that the previous enforcement actions were in error and that affected residents can request refunds. I said, "What about Nancy?" He said, "She resigned. The board accepted her resignation effective immediately, and she is banned from holding any HOA position for 5 years. I felt a wave of relief, but I was not done. I said, "I want a written reversal from management with a real citation of the policy violations, and I want it posted in the clubhouse and the group chat." Ben said, "I will make sure that happens." A week later, I got a certified letter from the HOA management company. It included a formal apology, a check refunding all the fines I had paid under protest, and a copy of the new enforcement policy. It also included a statement that said, "The board has determined that prior enforcement actions related to guest parking and decal display were inconsistent with the governing documents and have been rescinded. Affected residents are encouraged to contact the management office for refunds or corrections to their account." The letter was also posted in the clubhouse and emailed to every resident in the neighborhood. The group chat went silent for about an hour, then exploded with comments. People were asking what happened, who was responsible, and whether they could get refunds too. A few people apologized to me directly, saying they did not know the full story and felt bad about the earlier posts. I did not respond. I did not need their apologies. I just needed them to see that Nancy had been lying the whole time. If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA nightmare tales. A few days after that, I ran into my neighbor, a quiet guy named Carlos who lives 2 units down. He stopped me in the parking lot and said, "I just want to say thank you." I said, "For what?" He said, "For fighting back. Nancy did the same thing to me 6 months ago. She claimed my guest was parked illegally and had my friend's car towed. I paid the fees because I did not know what else to do, and I have been afraid to have anyone visit since then." He said, "A neighbor who quietly says this happened to them too, and now I know I was not the only one." I said, "You should file for a refund." He said, "I will. Thank you." That conversation made everything worth it. I realized Nancy had been doing this for months, maybe years, and nobody had pushed back because they were afraid or did not know how. I got lucky because I had an attorney and I knew how to pull public records, but most people do not have that. The new policy would not fix everything, but it was a start. The next board meeting was packed. I went with Ben, and we sat in the back row. The new board president, a woman named Laura who seemed reasonable, opened the meeting by acknowledging the policy changes and apologizing for the previous enforcement issues. She said, "We take our fiduciary duty seriously, and we are committed to transparency and fairness moving forward." She also announced that the HOA agrees to mediation with a neutral third party for any resident who felt they had been unfairly targeted, and that Nancy Mitchell, the former landscaping committee lead, was no longer affiliated with the board in any capacity. Someone in the audience asked what happened to the towing contract. Laura said, "The contract with Summit Tow and Recovery has been terminated, and we are currently accepting bids from multiple vendors with no exclusivity or revenue-sharing clauses." Another person asked if Nancy would face any consequences. Laura said, "That is a personnel matter, but I can tell you that Karen is ordered to stop contacting the narrator directly, and any future contact will be considered harassment and will be referred to law enforcement." I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned around, and it was Carlos. He said, "That was you, wasn't it?" I said, "I just asked questions." He said, "You did more than that. Thank you." A few other people nodded, and I realized I was not alone anymore. After the meeting, Laura approached me and said, "I want to apologize personally. I was not on the board when this happened, but I should have been paying more attention." I said, "It is not your fault." She said, "Maybe not, but I am going to make sure it does not happen again." She handed me her card and said, "If you ever have a concern, call me directly." I said, "I appreciate that." I walked out of the meeting and saw Rick's tow truck parked across the street. He was leaning against the driver's door, arms crossed, watching people leave. I walked over and said, "Rick, what are you doing here?" He said, "I wanted to see how it played out." I said, "You know you were part of the problem, right?" He said, "I know. Nancy paid me a bonus for every car I towed, and I did not ask questions. I should have." I said, "Yeah, you should have." He said, "For what it is worth, I am not taking HOA contracts anymore. I am sticking to private property and police calls." I said, "Good," and I walked away. A week later, I got a call from the State Attorney General's office. The investigator said they were reviewing the complaint and the evidence I had submitted, and that they were opening a formal inquiry into the HOA's towing practices and vendor contracts. He said, "We have received multiple complaints about similar issues in other HOA communities, and your case is helping us build a pattern." I said, "What happens next?" He said, "We will interview witnesses, review contracts, and determine whether there were any violations of state consumer protection or fiduciary duty laws. If we find violations, we can issue fines, require policy changes, or refer the matter for prosecution. I said, "How long will that take?" He said, "A few months, but we will keep you updated." I hung up and felt like I could finally breathe. The fight was not over, but the momentum had shifted. Nancy was gone, the policy had changed, and other people were starting to speak up. I was not going to get my time back, and I was not going to erase the stress, but I had won something bigger. I had broken the system that let Nancy operate unchecked, and I had given other people a path to fight back. A month later, the HOA held a special meeting to vote on new board members. I did not run, but I showed up to vote. Carlos ran, and he won. So did two other people who had been targeted by Nancy's enforcement blitz. The new board was younger, more diverse, and way more skeptical of the old guard. Laura stayed on as president, and she immediately started working with Carlos and the others to rewrite the parking enforcement rules from scratch. The first thing they did was eliminate the fire lane designations that Nancy had invented. It turned out that half the curbs she had painted red were not actually fire lanes under city code, and the fire department had never approved them. The board hired a consultant to review the markings, and within 2 weeks, most of the fake fire lanes were repainted gray. The second thing they did was ban handheld plate scanners and require that all violation notices include a photo, a specific rule citation, and an appeal process. The third thing they did was post all vendor contracts online so residents could see who the HOA was doing business with and how much they were paying. It was not perfect, but it was progress. I started parking in my assigned spot again without fear. I had friends over without worrying about guest passes. I stopped checking my mailbox every day for violation notices. Life felt normal again. One afternoon, I was working on a sprinkler repair near the clubhouse when I saw Nancy's car pull into the visitor lot. She got out, walked to the mailbox cluster, and pulled out a stack of mail. She looked thinner, older, and tired. She saw me, and for a second we made eye contact. I did not say anything. She did not say anything. She got back in her car and drove away. I never saw her again. A few months later, I got a letter from the HOA's insurance carrier. It said that due to multiple claims and compliance issues, they were issuing a non-renewal warning, and that the HOA had 30 days to implement reforms, or they would lose coverage. The letter listed specific deficiencies, including the towing contract, the lack of oversight on fines, and the absence of a formal appeals process. It said, the insurance carrier issues a non-renewal warning, demands reforms within days, and the board caves because the whole neighborhood could lose coverage. Laura called an emergency board meeting, and within a week, every single reform was in place. The board adopted a formal appeals process, hired an independent management company to handle enforcement, and banned any board member from signing vendor contracts without a full board vote. The changes were not just for show. They were real, binding, and enforceable. I ran into Laura at the grocery store a few weeks later, and she said, "You know, you saved this place." I said, "I just wanted to park my car." She said, "You did more than that. You forced us to be accountable, and that is something we should have been doing all along." I said, "I appreciate that," and I walked away feeling like maybe, just maybe, the system could work if people pushed hard enough. I still live in the Heights at Summit Ridge Design Review Association. I still work as a landscape irrigation tech. I still have my custody schedule, and I have not missed a single pickup. My daughter asked me once if the mean lady was gone, and I said, "Yeah, she is gone." She said, "Good. I did not like her." I said, "Me neither, kiddo." The neighborhood is quieter now. The group chat is less toxic. People say hello when I walk by. Carlos and I grab coffee once a week, and we talk about the board meetings and the new policies and the slow work of fixing a broken system. It is not glamorous, and it is not fast, but it is real. I learned a lot from this fight. I learned that HOAs operate in the shadows because most people do not know how to pull records or read bylaws or challenge enforcement. I learned that one person with a clipboard and a vendetta can cause chaos if nobody pushes back. I learned that leverage matters, and that sometimes the threat of a lawsuit or an insurance claim is more powerful than the lawsuit itself. I learned that allies matter, and that quiet neighbors who have been hurt will speak up if you give them a reason to trust you. Most of all, I learned that you do not have to accept abuse just because it comes from someone in authority. Nancy thought she could bully me into submission because she had a title and a clipboard and a tow truck on speed dial. She thought I would pay the fines and shut up and disappear like everyone else. But I did not, and that made all the difference. I still have the violation notices. I keep them in a folder in my closet, along with the towing contract, the insurance letter, and the settlement agreement. I do not look at them often, but I like knowing they are there. They remind me that I fought back, and I won, and that nobody can take that away from me. A few months after everything settled, I got an email from the State Attorney General's office. The investigator said they had completed their review and found multiple violations of state consumer protection laws, including deceptive trade practices and breach of fiduciary duty. The HOA was fined $15,000, and Nancy was personally fined $5,000. The email said, "The evidence you provided was critical to this outcome, and we appreciate your cooperation." I forwarded the email to Ben and to Carlos, and we all had a quiet celebration over beers that weekend. The final piece came a year later. The HOA held its annual election, and the old guard was completely voted out. The new board included Carlos, 2 other residents who had been targeted, and a retired attorney who volunteered to serve as compliance officer. Laura stayed on as president, and together they rewrote the enforcement policy from the ground up. The new policy required photo evidence for every violation, a mandatory 5-day notice period before any fine, a free first appeal, and a ban on exclusive vendor contracts. It also created a resident oversight committee that reviewed all fines over $200 and had the power to void any fine that did not meet the evidence standard. It was everything I had hoped for, and more. I did not run for the board myself, but I showed up to every meeting and I voted on every issue. I became the guy who asked the hard questions and held people accountable, and I was okay with that. One night, I was sitting on my porch with my daughter, watching the sunset, and she said, "Dad, why do you go to all those boring meetings?" I said, "Because if I do not, bad people will make bad rules, and good people will get hurt." She said, "Like the mean lady?" I said, "Yeah, like the mean lady." She said, "I am glad you stopped her." I said, "Me too, kiddo. Me too." Looking back, the whole thing feels surreal. I moved to Burlington to be close to my daughter, and I ended up in a war with an HOA over a guest pass that moved 2 inches. But that war taught me something important. It taught me that power is not permanent, and that systems can change if people fight hard enough. It taught me that evidence matters, and that the right piece of paper at the right time can flip everything. It taught me that allies are everywhere, even in quiet neighbors who have been hurt and are waiting for someone to speak up first. Nancy thought she could control the neighborhood with fines and threats and a friendly tow truck driver. She thought nobody would challenge her because nobody ever had. But she was wrong, and when I challenged her, the whole system collapsed. The towing contract was voided, the fines were refunded, the policy was rewritten, and Nancy was gone. It was not just a win for me. It was a win for Carlos, and for everyone else who had been targeted and silenced. I still see Rick's tow truck sometimes, driving through other neighborhoods. I wonder if he learned anything, or if he is still taking kickbacks and hooking up cars on fake violations. I do not know, and I do not care. He is not my problem anymore. The painted fire lane curb where Nancy used to stand and point and threaten is now painted gray. The handheld scanner she used to wave around like a magic wand is gone. The stack of violation notices she carried on her clipboard is gone. The tow truck that used to idle outside my unit is gone. The fear that used to wake me up at 3 in the morning is gone. All of it is gone, and I am still here. I learned that the fight is not over when you win once. The fight is over when the system changes, so that the next person does not have to fight at all. I did not just want to beat Nancy. I wanted to make sure that the next person who moved into the Heights at Summit Ridge Design Review Association would not have to go through what I went through. And I think I did that. The new policy is not perfect, but it is fair, and it is transparent, and it is enforced by people who actually care about doing the right thing. Carlos told me once that he thought about moving out after Nancy had his friend's car towed. He said he felt trapped and scared and powerless, and he did not know what to do. He said, "But then I saw you fight back, and I realized I did not have to accept it. So I stayed, and I ran for the board, and now I am part of the solution." That is the real victory, not the settlement or the fines or the resignation. The real victory is that people like Carlos do not feel powerless anymore. I still work as a landscape irrigation tech. I still fix sprinkler heads and broken valves and deal with HOA boards that think they know more about irrigation than I do. But I do not take any grief from them anymore. I know my rights, I know how to pull records, and I know how to fight back. And if they push me, I push back harder. My daughter is older now, and she asks more questions. She asked me once if I ever felt like giving up. I said, "Yeah, all the time." She said, "Why did not you?" I said, "Because if I gave up, Nancy would have won, and other people would have gotten hurt." She said, "That is a good reason." I said, "I think so too." I do not think about Nancy much anymore. I do not wonder where she went or what she is doing. I do not care. She is a ghost, a memory, a cautionary tale. The only time I think about her is when someone new moves into the neighborhood and asks about the parking rules, and I tell them the story. I tell them about the guest pass that moved 2 inches, and the tow truck that showed up, and the fines that were invented, and the fight that followed. I tell them about the evidence, and the settlement, and the policy change, and the insurance threat. I tell them about Carlos, and Laura, and Ben, and Rick, and the state attorney general. I tell them the whole thing, start to finish, and I watch their faces change as they realize that the system can be beaten if you know how. And then I hand them Laura's card and I say, "If you ever have a problem, call her. She will listen. And if she does not, call me. I know how this works now, and I am not afraid to fight." That is the legacy of this fight, not the settlement check, not the apology letter, not the resignation. The legacy is that people know they do not have to accept abuse from an HOA just because the HOA has power. The legacy is that the system changed, and people like Carlos are running the board, and people like Nancy are gone. The legacy is that I can park my car in my driveway without fear, and my daughter can visit without worrying that her dad is going to get fined or towed or harassed. That is what I fought for, and that is what I won. And every time I pull into my driveway and see my car sitting there, safe and untouched, I remember that it was worth it. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.